All right, Tanya Summary Shiur, week 34, Kanai. We're finishing off chapter 3, really the bulk of chapter 3, and chapter 4 of Igeras HaTshuva. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. So in chapter 3, in the beginning, the Alter Rebbe spoke about the concept of fasting, not quite as atonement for sins, to more better the standing that a person has with Hashem, the same way that if a person upsets a king, even though they might get away in the clear from the law, if they have good lawyers or whatever it may take. But at the same time, you want to have a good relationship with the king, and you want to be able to give a gift to get rid of whatever blemish might have been caused, even if you've gotten off with the law, but you want to have the relationship be fine and proper. So the Alter Rebbe says this concept of fasting that existed back in the day, that was the standard back in the day, is no longer the standard. And he says the reason why is because we're weaker, we're not able to fast as well as they did back in the day. Whatever it is that changed, diet or habits or physical strength, whatever it is, something is different nowadays that we see clearly, that we're not able to properly function in all of our capacities, whether it's doing Avodah properly or learning Torah properly or being, doing what Hashem wants properly, whatever the case is. It's very difficult to fast and be able to do all of that properly. And what kind of gift are you giving to Hashem if you're not able to do what He wants, which includes being happy and healthy and learning Torah and doing mitzvahs? If just to sit in a room and fast, that's obviously not the intention. So the Alter Rebbe says the Eitzah is, as it says in Ksovim, throw off the Averis with tzedakah. And the Alter Rebbe says this is a well-known concept discussed in Peskim. It comes up in Hilchos Shabbos, it comes up in a few places, the idea of giving tzedakah to be paid their fast. There's a concept of, for an Aver that has a chiyuv of a carbon chatas, to give the value of a chatas, for other Averis to give the value of chay gedolei pelin, gedolei pelish, a certain kind of coin back then, which amounts to what we would call 30 silver pieces nowadays. Not to give exact dollar amounts, the price of silver fluctuates. But yeah, that's the point, to be able to give that amount of money for fasts. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is all good and well for tzedakah as an extra thing. The Alter Rebbe says a Baal Nefesh, someone that really is concerned in this regard, if they have the wherewithal, some people do have the wherewithal, should try to do two things. The first thing is, we mentioned before, the idea of how these fasts add up to multiples of 3. That is to say that if a person does a certain Avera, they do it once, they need to fast X amount of times. If they do the Avera twice, they need to fast 2X amount of times. They do it 3 times, they need to fast 3X amount of times, and that's where it stops. If they do it 15 times, they only need to fast 3X amount of times. The Alter Rebbe says, seeing as it is an argument, maybe they should need to fast 15X amount of times. So the Alter Rebbe says to redeem those fasts with tzedakah, that without any concern. But the Alter Rebbe says if a person wants to be machmir on themselves and they have the wherewithal, it won't interfere with their avodah, they should try to fast at least one round of fasts as regular full day fasts. It could be spread out over a very long period of time, says the Alter Rebbe. And in addition, to do the other 2 sets of fasts until the multiple of 3, to do those as sets of half fasts. The Alter Rebbe says there's a concept in Yerushalmi of fasting half a day being counted as a half a fast. So he says do that 4 times, and that counts as 2 fasts, or do that twice, and that counts as 1 fast. So a person should do that until they make up the requisite amount. So they have, to summarize, 1 round of complete fasts, and then 4 rounds of half fasts, which add up to 2 fasts. So that way they have their 3 cycles of fasts all taken care of in actual fasting, and then the extra, they can definitely, they don't have anything to be concerned about, they can redeem it with tzedakah. The Alter Rebbe says a person might come and say, hey, this is adding up to a lot of money. And really, if you do the math, it does turn out to be, about $10 a fast, but a various add up very quickly. Now, that's not saying an exact amount, I'm just saying that's roughly how much it would equate to. But $10 a fast, when you add it up, a lot of Averas happen, and it's a lot of money. So the Alter Rebbe says a person might be concerned and say there's a din that a person shouldn't give to an embarrassing extent more than a fifth. That is to say that a person shouldn't use more than a fifth of their money for mitzvahs. We need to be functional people. We need to have our own finances so that we don't just become paupers and then need to take tzedakah. So in Usha, the Chachamim made an establishment that a person shouldn't spend more than a fifth shouldn't give away more than a fifth of their money for tzedakah. So the Alter Rebbe says, this is not stam tzedakah, this is tzedakah to save yourself. And he says, it's like skin for skin. Everything a person has, they'll give for their life. So a person wouldn't hesitate to spend every penny they had on medical bills if they needed chas v'shalom, if they needed medical assistance. The Alter Rebbe says in a similar way, if they have, or in an even greater way, if they have spiritual concerns, spiritual health, then they should definitely have no concern with giving extra, and the person's allowed to spend whatever they want on themselves. So that concludes chapter 3. There's a lot to be discussed on that last concept of spending more on oneself for tzedakah purposes, but this is a summary share, not an even share. But anyhow, let's move on to chapter 4. So in chapter 4, the Alter Rebbe starts a new concept, kind of. It's related to the last concept. Obviously, it's one letter. But the Alter Rebbe says that thus far, we mentioned two concepts. We've been talking about the concept of appeasing Hashem, getting back into His good graces, but we mentioned at the beginning of Igeres Tshuva that there's actually a concept of tshuva. This is not tshuva. Fasting is not tshuva. Tshuva is to return to Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe says there's a question that seemingly was a question that was big by the masses, something that people struggled with. People were struggling with this for centuries, perhaps millennium, of how to properly do tshuva. We all want to do tshuva. So the Alter Rebbe says the essence of tshuva is to return to Hashem with truth, with a complete heart. But the Alter Rebbe says I need to give more of an explanation for what this means. And he says a good way to get into this is to say something not controversial per se, but something that is difficult to understand. Usually when you have a question, you're able to pick it apart and come to a better conclusion. So the Alter Rebbe says that there's two kinds of tshuva. It says in the Zohar that tshuva is comprised of the words tashuv hey, to return the hey. So there's two heys, apparently. There's the lower hey and there's the upper hey. So the Alter Rebbe says, essentially, the very obvious question of what does that mean? So the Alter Rebbe says, I'll add another question that we're going to answer along the way, but also keeps things spicy. It says that in a few places in Zohar, that tshuva does not help for someone that is pigim v'vris, someone that blemishes their sign of Hashem, which is essentially to say that they're motzi zera levatala, that they emit seed for no good reason. So the Alter Rebbe says this notion is very, very surprising, because we know that there's nothing that can stand before tshuva, and even avodah zarah and gilei arayis meaning illicit sexual relations. So illicit sexual relations, a person is able to do tshuva for. Apparently, we see this clearly in Chazal, but the zara levatala, the particular concept of the seed being emitted in vain, apparently is something that the Zohar says a person can't do tshuva for. So how's this possible? So the Alter Rebbe says in Reishis Chachma, which is a book which collects a lot of Kabbalistic sources from the Arizal, from the Zohar, and elaborates on them, combines them together, strings them together by subject. So in Reishis Chachma it explains that tshuva tata, lower tshuva, can't help for zera levatala, but tshuva ilah can. So Alter Rebbe says, what does this mean? So Alter Rebbe says, in order to understand this, we need to back up a very big step for a moment. He said we need to understand first what the Chachamim said about the concept of karis and misivdei shemayim, which are two punishments that essentially imply death to some degree. And it says that if a person would be chayiv karis, then they would literally pass away before they reach 50 years of age. And with misivdei shemayim, they would literally pass away before passing 60 years of age. And this is something which is expressed in Nach with the Navi Hananiah ben Azar, whether he was a real Navi or not, whole discussion. But essentially, there's a person that ended up saying a false prophecy, and Yirmiyah said, if what you're saying is taka not true, which I suspect it is, then you will not live the next year. And taka, he passed away. And the chiyuv of false prophecy is at the very least misivdei shemayim, depending on a lot of different details of context and whatnot. But it's definitely at the very least misivdei shemayim. So you see, he got what was coming to him. He actually literally died. Misivdei shemayim is not some kind of exaggeration or joke. It means that there's actual death to be expected. So the Alter Rebbe says this is quite puzzling, because nowadays we don't see anyone dropping dead before the age of 50, very randomly or sporadically, because they did a certain avera. And actually we see a lot of people that they do a lot of these averas that have a chiyuv of misa or have a chiyuv of karis, that they live good and well. So this is a very puzzling thing. So the Alter Rebbe says, I'm going to give another introduction. All of these threads are going to come together. But the Alter Rebbe says we need to get into another concept. So it says in the pasuk, Yichelek Hashem Amay, that the portion of Hashem is His nation. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is like what it's written, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, that Hashem blew into man a spirit of living life, a spirit of living breath. And We need to understand this because it's a very classic line. It's from the Piyut of Yigdal, that Hashem has no body, and this is something that has been definitely accepted in Yiddishkeit, that Hashem has no body. So what does it mean that Hashem blew? Hashem doesn't have a set of lungs to blow. So the Alter Rebbe says really it's a parable. What does the parable mean? The Alter Rebbe says let's get into that. Usually we use anthropomorphic terms to describe Hashem. This is what we're used to. This is what we know because we are ourselves quite anthropomorphic, so anthropomorphic that we have more of the anthro than the concept of the morphic. We're people, and so we use people-centered examples to describe what Hashem does. So the Alter Rebbe says there's two ways that a person usually expels breath. Either they talk, and so breath goes in and out. And it's just casual, whether they're talking or not, but just a very slow intake and output of breath. Another way that a person could expel breath is by intentionally blowing hard. So the Alter Rebbe says there's a very big difference between talking, where breath is let out slowly but surely, giving each word some minute amount of emphasis, and a person breathing out, where the whole thing, they're squeezing out their lungs. They're squeezing out whatever air is inside of them. So the Alter Rebbe says that in general, these two ways of expelling breath refer to how deep something is coming from within a person. Talking it's expelling some of the person's breath, but it's not really squeezing to their core. Breathing deeply is really squeezing out the insides. So the Alter Rebbe says this also expresses two ways that Hashem created things in the world. For typical things, we say Hashem spoke them into existence. With 10 utterances, Hashem created the world, as the Mishnah says. So he spoke everything into existence, which means that, yeah, there's some of his essence in it, but it's mainly the content of what's being said, and it only contains some small amount of his essence to a degree. Obviously, everything is Hashem and only Hashem, but as far as an expression of his essence, it's not as great as breathing deeply, which we're going to get into that concept of the expression of his essence in his talking in Hashem later, but for now, this is the general concept. The Alter Rebbe says that the neshamas, the soul, Hashem created in a very different way. It's not about the content of what's being expressed, it's about Hashem just breathed himself, he breathed from his essence, from his center. He breathed that out. That is what a soul is. So there's two very different ways that everything in the world functions versus souls, because everything in the world is an expression of an external aspect of Hashem, whereas the soul is an expression of the internal aspect of Hashem. The Alter Rebbe says that we can see this from what it says, that Hashem is a portion of his nation, which is to say that we have within ourselves some, in a sense, expression of Hashem. And not just Hashem in general, there's 7 general names that we use for Hashem. And Shem Havaya is one particular one. Shem Havaya refers to the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of Hashem, Yud Ke Vav Ke. And the Alter Rebbe explains how these 4 letters refer to the 10 spheres in general. He says the letter Yud contains within itself, it has the tip of the Yud, which refers to the Ratzin, the will of Hashem, which is above expression, but the Yud itself refers to Chokhmah, refers to wisdom. It's a particular point which can then be developed and expressed, given breadth and width. And you see that in the letter Hey, which is the next letter, which refers to Bina. And the letter Hey has 2 dimensions. It goes from being a single point to being 2 dimensions. And then it's able to be drawn down. The letter Vav is aligned from top to bottom, so it refers to the Midas, to the emotive aspects, the aspects of relating to something else. And then ultimately, when it reaches the bottom of the Midas, it is able to spread out to an even greater degree, which is expressed by the next letter Hey, which also has width and breadth. So you see that Hashem, in a sense, gave over to us that we're able to express ourselves with these 10 spheres, and we were created in the image of Hashem, that we have all of these expressions, that we're able to serve Him with them. We're able to think about Him, appreciate His glory, relate to Him, serve Him in a practical sense. All of these things, the fact that we're conscious beings, that we're partially created in the image of Hashem, these things come from the fact that we have souls. We're not just a piece of wood. We're not just a piece of mud. We have souls, and this is what distinguishes us, that we have this expression of Hashem's internal aspect, that we're created from Hashem's internal parts, more so than the rest of the world, which is truly an expression of Hashem, something which we'll be discussing in Hashem later, that there's different advantages to each side, but we're an amalgamation of both, we're a combination of both. We're both created from a body, but we also have a soul, which is an expression of the internal aspect of Hashem. That concludes chapter 4. Went a little bit more in depth in chapter 4 than I thought we would, but there's a lot going on. Just to summarize briefly the concepts that we mentioned in chapter 4, there's the concept of we need to understand what is the essence of tshuva. We need to understand there are two levels of tshuva. What are they? We need to understand why we say that some averis can't be atoned for with a lower level of tshuva. We also need to understand why it only applies to particular averis, even though they might be less stringent as others, that you have certain more stringent averis that are able to be atoned for with regular tshuva, and then these seemingly lower averis, these seemingly less stringent averis, can only be atoned for with the higher level of tshuva. And we also need to understand more about this concept of Hashem creating things in the universe with two general modes, particularly everything versus the soul, that everything is typically only an expression of external aspects of Hashem, and the soul is an expression of the internal aspect of Hashem. With that, we conclude today's Tanya Summary Shiur. Looking forward to all of the explanations which are definitely forthcoming to understand these deep concepts, which ultimately can bring us to a very good relationship with Hashem.